Okay, sorry about that interruption. Anytime I get a message on my phone, it stops recording, which makes this more difficult to do. But we were talking about these 5 major elements of classical conditioning that you'll need to be able to identify in any example of conditioning. So we talked about the idea of stimulus, meaning a thing that causes something. And in classical conditioning, just to recap, you'll have a neutral stimulus, an unconditioned stimulus, and a conditioned stimulus. And we talked about what neutral means. When you're seeing the word unconditioned, so you see an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Unconditioned just means unlearned or natural. So an unconditioned stimulus is something that would naturally cause an unconditioned response or an unlearned response. So in the case with Pavlov and his dogs, food would act as an unconditioned stimulus because it automatically would cause the unconditioned response or unlearned response of drool in an animal such as a dog. So the point of classical conditioning is to take that natural connection, unconditioned stimulus causing an unconditioned response, food causing drool, and to bring in or introduce a neutral stimulus. In this case, it would be the bell. And by pairing an unconditioned stimulus over and over again with a neutral stimulus, pairing the food and the bell, eventually the animal would learn to make an association between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Every time the bell rang, food was presented. And eventually, if that pairing happens enough, the animal would make a learned association between these two stimulus. And if conditioning occurs, what happens then, and the whole point of conditioning, is to take that neutral stimulus and to transform it into a conditioned stimulus. So when you get to the point where the bell alone is causing those dogs to drool and you can take away that unconditioned stimulus, you can remove the food and you're still getting the same behavior, then conditioning has happened. And when that happens, the neutral stimulus transforms into a conditioned stimulus, and that conditioned stimulus, the bell, will now create a conditioned response, which is drool. The response is still the same in both, whether it's unconditioned or conditioned. The response in this situation is always drool. However, when the food caused the drool, it was natural, it was unlearned, so that is an unconditioned response. After conditioning, it's the bell that causes the dog to drool, and this would be then a conditioned response. The bell transforms from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, and now it causes a conditioned response, which is drool. So I know this can be very tough at first for students. So in your PowerPoint, I broke it down a lot of different ways. I kind of wrote it out verbally so you can read through it, the steps, right? So you start with always a relationship between two things that is natural. The unconditioned stimulus will always cause an unconditioned response. So in Pavlov's dog's example, the unconditioned stimulus, which is food, would naturally cause a dog to drool. That's the unconditioned response. Unconditioned means unlearned or natural. Then in order for conditioning to occur, you have to add in a neutral stimulus. You take something that shouldn't have any meaning, it doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that you're going to pair it with the unconditioned stimulus. So Pavlov chose a bell. He could have chosen an image, he could have chosen a sound or a sight. He chose a bell and he paired it repeatedly. He took the neutral stimulus, the bell, and paired it continuously with an unconditioned stimulus, the food. And these two unrelated things being paired together many times create a learned association. And when this happens, when this learned association happens, the neutral stimulus is always going to be transformed into a conditioned stimulus. It goes from being neutral to being conditioned or learned, okay? And conditioning will have said to have occurred, classical conditioning will have occurred when that neutral stimulus transforms into a conditioned stimulus, and then the conditioned stimulus creates a conditioned response. So when we get to the point where the bell alone is causing those dogs to drool, we would say they have been classically conditioned. The neutral stimulus, the bell, at this point would be called the conditioned stimulus, and it is now causing a conditioned response of drool because those dogs are not drooling to what they naturally would, which is the food. They're now drooling to a conditioned stimulus, which is the bell. So their response now is called a conditioned response, a learned response. Okay? I've also added in an image, so if you're visual, this might help you. Once you get used to these terms, it becomes very easy to identify these elements. It just takes some practice, right? So before conditioning, the food, which is your unconditioned stimulus, caused natural drooling, which is your unconditioned response. Before conditioning, your bell, which was the neutral stimulus, caused nothing in the dog. There was no response. During conditioning, you're going to pair your bell, your neutral stimulus, with your food, your unconditioned stimulus, over and over and over again to create a learned association. Okay? And it together will cause an unconditioned response. Due to this pairing, that learned association will be created, and when this happens, you will say conditioning has occurred. Classical conditioning has occurred, because now the bell has transformed from a neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. You can take out the food, you no longer need that unconditioned stimulus, you just need the bell now, and the bell alone, the conditioned stimulus, will now create a conditioned response, which is drool. The response is the same, but now it's called conditioned because it's being caused by the bell and not by the original unconditioned stimulus, which is food. Okay? And then I also wrote it out step by step for you. And you can keep this in your notes. And it's up to you what you want to do with this lecture. If you want to write out notes into your notebook, so it really kind of solidifies into your memory, that's awesome. If you want to just print these out and refer to them, that's okay too. But you will have to know how to walk yourself through an example and explain an example of classical conditioning where you're identifying these 5 elements. So a lot of the rest of this PowerPoint is examples. So what I would like you to do, I told you in the instructions, I want you to have my video lecture open, but I also want you to have the PowerPoint. And at this time, I would like you to pause the video lecture and watch this video clip. It's really funny. If you watch The Office, you may have seen it. In this clip, Jim, who is the younger cute guy in this clip, he's heard about Pavlov's experiment, and he's trying to classically condition his buddy in the office, Dwight, just like Pavlov conditioned his dog. So what he's going to do is he's going to take an Altoid, which is like a mint, and every time he offers Dwight a mint, he's going to make a noise like a doo-doo-doo on his computer. And he's going to pair that together to see if eventually he can condition Dwight to drool at the sound of his computer instead of the mint. Okay, so I want you to watch it quickly, and I want you to look at that terminology sheet that was on the slide before, and I want you to try to see if you can identify those 5 elements of classical conditioning. So pause it now, watch the clip, and see if you can make sense out of the clip yourself. Okay, so hopefully you did it and you tried it on your own so you learn it, but let's go through this. So on a test, or if you take university next year, you'll have to be able to explain and identify these elements. And once you master them, like I said, you could be very creative and you could try your own experiment of classical conditioning at home. And if you send me a video, it would be amazing. But you can condition a pet or a sibling. It doesn't matter what you're using as long as you get a conditioned response to any kind of stimuli that you introduce. So in this example, our neutral stimulus was the computer sound, because a computer sound should not have caused Dwight to drool a little bit in his mouth. The unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response was the mint and the drool. Because when someone gives you a mint, you automatically drool a little bit in your mouth, right? You kind of build up that saliva. So what was happening in this clip is Jim was taking the mint and the drool, that unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response, and he was introducing the neutral stimulus into it by pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus. So every time he offered Dwight a mint, he would make the computer sound. And so through that pairing, Dwight would have created a learned association between the sound of the computer and the sensation of having the mint in his mouth, which was causing the drool. And if conditioning occurred and it was successful, the neutral stimulus, which is the computer sound, would then be transformed into the conditioned stimulus. So eventually you could take the mint away. You didn't have to give him a mint anymore. Just the sound of the computer alone should have made him start to kind of drool in his mouth. And if this happened, that response now is a conditioned response because it's in response not to the mint, but to a random thing, a computer sound, which now has acquired meaning through classical conditioning, okay? The next example I showed you in the very first unit we looked at, it was a student who made this video for his psychology class, and he wanted to take Pavlov's theory and he wanted to test it on his roommate. So what he's going to do is he wants to see if he can classically condition his roommate to flinch when he makes a sound, and he has a button and he pushes it and it says, that was easy. And every time he pushes that button and his roommate hears that sound, he's gonna shoot his roommate with a Nerf gun. And basically he wants to see if he can condition his roommate to flinch to the sound of the button instead of the gun. So again, here I want you to pause me and I want you to watch this video clip and see if you can identify the parts of it. So pause me and go watch the video. Okay? So what I was asking you to look for were the 5 elements of classical conditioning. So you have the choice of the sound, that was easy, the airsoft gun, and the flinch. And you have to tell me which of those are neutral, the neutral stimulus, conditioned, unconditioned, all of that. A general rule of thumb to remember is both responses, unconditioned or conditioned, are usually the same thing. It's what causes it that changes whether it's an unconditioned or a conditioned. And as another rule of thumb, your neutral stimulus is always going to become your conditioned stimulus. So if you can figure out those parts, it will help you. But let's start with the natural connection. In this scenario, the natural connection was that an airsoft gun being shot with a Nerf gun is automatically going to cause you to flinch. So being shot with the airsoft gun is an unconditioned stimulus because it's always going to cause an unconditioned response, which is flinching. Then he introduced a neutral stimulus. He took the button, that was easy, and he paired it over and over again with the gunshot, okay? And so that was the process of conditioning. And by the end of the video, what you saw is his roommate came to have a learned association between the sound, that was easy, and being shot. And eventually the sound alone caused him to flinch. And when that happens, you would say conditioning has occurred because your neutral stimulus has now transformed into a conditioned stimulus. And now that stimulus is what is causing the flinch. So the flinch has now become a conditioned response. Okay, so I hope this is making sense. It's a lot when you're first getting used to it. I put one more example in here that you can read through. Again, I would like you to try to figure it out on your own. George likes to take a quick shower before going to class. One morning while taking a shower, he hears a toilet flush, and then he experiences a lot of pain because the water becomes burning hot. He continues to shower. A few minutes later, he hears the toilet flush, and he automatically jumps out of the way. So this is a really quick example of classical conditioning. And one thing that you should know, and we'll talk about later, is conditioning usually has to be paired over and over and over and over again for the process to work. But if something is extreme enough or traumatic enough or painful enough, psychologists believe that pairing only has to happen once. And if it's strong enough, that learned association will happen instantly. So this one probably happened really quick because of the pain of the hot water. Okay, and once that learned association happens, conditioning happens. So again, pause this for a second and see if you can figure this out. I'm just gonna get a sip of water and make sure the video is still recording. We are still recording, that is great. Okay, here we go. So if you did this correctly, these are the answers you should have. The neutral stimulus was a toilet, the sound of the toilet flushing, because that shouldn't cause any response in you at all. The unconditioned stimulus was the hot water, because when hot water is poured on you, you're automatically going to jump or flinch in pain, which is your unconditioned response. Because the hot water was paired with the sound of the toilet, there was a learned association created. And conditioning occurred because now just the sound of the toilet flushing alone, which has now become the conditioned stimulus, will cause you to jump out of the way, which is now a conditioned response, okay? We're going to talk really quickly about John B. Watson and his very famous Baby Albert experiment. And I know we talked about this in Unit 1, and we also talked about it because they showed it in the video you watched. You also should have done your background reading on classical conditioning, that little chapter I got you to read yesterday. So you should be familiar with this experiment. This is John B. Watson. It says, I don't always scare babies, but when I do, it's for psychology. We know he conducted this very somewhat unethical experiment where he got himself an orphan and he wanted to see if he could classically condition fear in a human baby. So he took what Pavlov did with his dogs and he wanted to know, can you do that in a human? And if that's the case, can you condition any emotion into a human with any stimulus? And we know that's true. We know any stimulus has the ability to elicit any kind of reflexive, uncontrolled response or feeling in a human. So this is how we fear a lot of things. I have a really strong fear of the dentist. I really don't like going to the dentist. When I walk into the office, when I smell the fluoride, my stomach starts to hurt. I feel anxiety right away. I can't control that. Some point in my life, I've been classically conditioned between the stimulus and the smell of the dentist's office and fear. Okay? You can do the same thing with relaxation. Certain stimuli might cause you to relax. If you have a lucky sweater that you like to wear when you write a final exam because you think it makes you feel better, that's the type of conditioned response. You associate with wearing that sweater with feeling good and feeling relaxed. You can do it with smells. I know when I was young, whenever we go somewhere fancy, like to a wedding, my dad would always chew gum, so his breath was good, and he'd always chew spearmint gum. So now when I smell spearmint gum, it makes me happy because I have memories of my dad, right? So certain smells can trigger a good response. If someone you really dislike, maybe someone who abused you, always wore the same cologne, maybe that cologne now when you smell it triggers fear or triggers anxiety. Children who go to school and are constantly bullied, right? The sight of the school might trigger a panic or an anxiety feeling because they've learned association between that building and being afraid. This was a really important experiment because it proved that any human emotion could be classically conditioned and we could have it to any kind of stimuli. And it could cause your heart rate to increase, your breathing to go weird, and you to feel your moods to change. So he proved it in the baby experiment. We're not going to go through this in a ton of detail because you should know it by now. But just as a reminder, what happens in this experiment is he takes a 9-month-old baby and he wants to condition a fear of a white rat in baby Albert. Initially, baby Albert showed no kind of reaction to this white rat. So the white rat was neutral. When they put the white rat near the baby, he didn't have any kind of behavioral change or any response. What babies are afraid of is really loud noises. So a baby's nervous system is not developed well. And so really now loud noises will cause a startle reflex in them. And if you've ever been around babies, they have that kind of startle reflex where their whole body jumps at a bang. So loud noises do have the ability to cause fear in a baby, to cause them to cry. So this would be your unconditioned stimulus. The loud noise naturally will cause the unconditioned response of fear in a baby. So what John Watson did is he had his assistant put the white rat on the baby, and every time this happened, he would take this hammer and hit this big steel rod and create this really loud noise, and the baby would freak out, which is natural. What wasn't natural is that every time this happened, the white rat would be on him. And so that baby, after this pairing of the white rat and the loud noise, that baby learned an association between the white rat and fear, okay? And every time that little boy would then see the white rat, he would freak out. And so once this happened, once conditioning happened, you no longer had to make that loud noise. You could remove that, and the white rat alone would cause the fear response. And at this point, the baby had been classically conditioned to fear a white rat. Okay? So after those pairings, that's what happens. The really interesting thing about the baby Albert experiment is they discovered the principle that we now know is called generalization, which is when you not only have the conditioned response to the stimulus that you were conditioned to, but any other stimulus that is similar to it, right? So you might have an experience where you're young where you almost drowned in the lake. And so now you pair bodies of water with the fear of drowning. But it might generalize that you're scared of swimming pools, or maybe you're scared to get into a bathtub, right? So other situations that are similar, you generalize the response to them. So in little Albert's case, he not only feared a white rat, which is what he had been conditioned to, but he started to fear anything white and fluffy. So a cat or a fluffy white carpet. He even had the same response where he would cry when he saw Santa Claus's beard. And so this showed that once you're conditioned to a stimulus, sometimes you'll generalize to other similar stimuluses and they will cause the same kind of response, whether it's fear, relaxation, happiness, anxiety, heart racing. It will happen with similar stimuli. Okay? So again, you should be able to walk through Pavlov's experiment or Watson's experiment, so either the drooling dogs or the rat experiment, for test purposes. You should be able to explain it, you should be able to identify the parts of classical conditioning and explain how this process took place. So there's your answers for this one. So hopefully you tried it and this makes sense to you. Okay? And you can go through that. What I have next on the PowerPoint is this idea that this experiment's very, very important, okay? Because it proved that classical conditioning not only happens in animals, it's in humans, and that we can classically condition any emotional reaction to any stimulus, and that's huge, okay? What I put in here is actually really kind of funny, and when we meet again for a class call, we're going to talk about it. So what I want you to do is, again, to pause my lecture and to watch this video. It's from an episode of Ellen where she sends two of her co-workers through one of the scariest haunted house experiences in America. And so they have to go through this haunted house, but it's a really great example of classical conditioning. Because when you watch a horror movie or when you go in through a fake haunted house, all it is a series of stimuli that we have been classically conditioned to fear instantly. They're all images or things, stimulus, that instantly cause your heart to race, that instantly cause a fear response. And this has been done through classical conditioning. So what I want you to do when you watch it is I want you to try to identify 5 different stimuli throughout the haunted house experience that instantly has been a classically conditioned stimulus. That as soon as you see it, you're going to have a conditioned response of fear. So the really obvious one is clowns, right? Most people, because of horror movies and society, have been classically conditioned that when they see a clown, they feel afraid. Okay, something that should not make us feel that way does through classical conditioning. There are so many in here. And if you think of any horror movie, if you think of when a horror movie, when something's about to jump out in a horror movie, the music changes and it becomes more intense, and you almost instantly feel your stomach tighten, or some people will naturally go like this and start to cover their eyes because their anxiety's building. And that's conditioned, right? We're conditioned to that when we watch movies, to know something scary is happening, and we have that uncontrolled response to that stimulus, to the music or the image. So there's a whole bunch in here. Even the dark, in a sense, is a classically conditioned response, to be afraid of the dark. Small spaces. They use so many aspects of classical conditioning in this example. It's actually awesome when you think about all of the images we've been conditioned to fear and putting them all together to create an experience like this, where you're going to have heightened anxiety the whole time you go through it because of a series of conditioned stimuli. Okay? You can think about what else in our society we've been conditioned to fear. These are common ones. These are all mine. So when I see that instantly, so some point in my life, I don't even want to look at it, some point in my life, I've associated an image of a spider with fear. Clowns is a big one. Clowns are supposed to bring us joy and make us happy, and most of the time, thanks to Stephen King and It, we're terrified when we see a clown. Dolls for me, old dolls, I think because of horror movies, they instantly cause a little bit of fear in me. Stranger danger, right? There are so many conditioned responses in society that we just automatically have a response to. And so where this is leading us is this is one of the theories of how we develop phobia. So what a phobia is, it's different than just a fear. A phobia has two parts that make it a phobia. The first one here is that it has to be irrational. It has to be, you're afraid of it, and it's out of proportion to the actual danger it possesses. So it has to be irrational, and it has to be out of proportion to how much danger you're actually in. So for example, if I'm like walking down the street late at night, and I see kind of a sketchy looking guy coming towards me, I might cross the street. That's not irrational. There is maybe potential danger there. So that would be normal. If I never walk anywhere alone because I feel that everyone is a potential threat to me, that would be a phobia, okay? So it has to be irrational and it has to be out of proportion to the danger it possesses. So for example, I have a fear of spiders. I don't think I have a phobia of spiders, because the other part is that it has to interfere with your normal functioning. So if I was in a house and I saw a spider crawl across my floor, I would freak out, don't get me wrong. But if it crawled away and I couldn't find it, I might be creeped out for a bit. I might not lie on the floor for a while, but eventually I get over it. I wouldn't like leave my house, right? I would just be uncomfortable, I'd be afraid. If I had a phobia, it would have to interfere with my functioning. Like I might not go back in that room if I couldn't find where that spider went. And so then that's irrational. And the amount of danger I'm in, it's disproportional. Nothing's gonna happen to me if there's a spider somewhere in my room. But in my mind it would, and it's interfering with my functioning. And so it'd be classified as an anxiety disorder, okay? But classical conditioning helps provide some insight into how phobias form. Because remember, it doesn't have to constantly be paired together. If the learned association is strong or traumatic, and it happens once, it can be created in your brain. So you had a bad experience with this one stimulus once, and now it's been paired with fear, and that fear is now crippling or preventing your, or interfering with your daily life. Okay? And we're gonna look a little bit at phobias next lesson as well. So this is a really good example. There are lots of people who suffer claustrophobia, which is the fear of enclosed spaces, tiny spaces. So pretend you're a psychologist dealing with a patient who has come to you with extreme claustrophobia. So they can't even go into elevators, or they can't, play hide and seek. So it's interfering with their life, because not being able to play hide and seek would definitely interfere with your life. That was a silly example, but it's interfering. They can't get into an elevator, okay? During therapy, you discover your patient was locked in a small space as a child and left there for a while, during which that child felt extreme anxiety. Using the principles of classical conditioning, how would you explain what happened? And I want you to think about that. So now you know as a child, this person was locked in a small space and they felt anxiety at that point. Okay, how does that explain why they can't get into an elevator now? Okay, so if you're using it, I want you to think about it. You can pause it and kind of think about those elements of classical conditioning. One explanation might be that being trapped in a small space when you were a child, that's an unconditioned stimulus. Because most people, when they're locked in a small space and they can't get out, it would be normal to have a fear response, which is your unconditioned response. Being trapped in a small space naturally would cause you to feel anxiety or panic. Okay? Now, because of conditioning, because of classical conditioning, this person has come to have an association with any small space and that experience. So now you fear anything that remotely resembles a closed space, like elevators or small rooms, things that should be neutral. An elevator should not cause you to have fear. But that's a neutral stimulus that is now transformed to a conditioned stimulus because it resembles the original stimulus enough that is creating that initial response again. So now any small space is acting like a conditioned stimulus, and you are responding with fear, which has been a conditioned response, right? And there would be an element of generalization there, that you're now not just conditioned to that initial experience of when you were locked in a closet as a child, but now you've generalized it to any small space like an elevator, and it's causing that conditioned response of fear, okay? So what I want you to do, this is your only thing to do this class besides listen to this lecture and make sense out of it. I want you to reflect on yourself and try to find your own personal example. So chances are good that you're afraid of some object or some kind of situation. Classical conditioning obviously offers some kind of explanation for this, for our fears and for our anxiety. So what I want you to do for this exit question is I want you to reflect on anything that you think you've been classically conditioned to fear. And I want you, or a phobia you might have, and I want you to explain how you think classical conditioning can explain this fear or phobia of yours. Okay, if you can, I want you to identify those 5 parts the best you can, but generally explain it. Right? Maybe you don't know where it originated from. Like, I don't know why I'm afraid of dentists. I never really had a really traumatic experience. But somewhere when I was young, I obviously made this connection with fear. But for example, when I was younger, I had trouble getting out of a pool and I thought I was going to drown, which was pretty traumatic. And now I really don't enjoy swimming very much. Like, I'll go in water, but I don't like going deep, like into deep water. And I'm very nervous when my children are around pools and stuff. I make sure they've all taken swimming lessons so they're good swimmers because I'm so afraid of them drowning. And when I take them to swimming classes, I feel anxious a lot when they're in the pool. And I'm trying to work on that and get that under control. But obviously that came from that experience as a child. Me almost drowning in that pool, I've now have a learned association, right? That pool, almost drowning, that was an unconditioned stimulus which caused fear because almost drowning would make you afraid. But now neutral stimuluses of swimming pools and the beach, right? Those have become conditioned stimulus for me that now cause a conditioned response of anxiety. So I want you to try to work out an example from your own life, identify those elements and explain it to me. If you don't have one, try to do one from something you've seen. You've probably had a friend or someone you know who has a fear of something. Try to use classical conditioning to explain it. We're going to start looking at phobias the next class. So the other thing I want you to do is I want you just to look up a list of phobias on your phone or device, and I want you to find the most interesting one or interesting couple and also send them to me. So you're doing this exit question and then you're just for interest looking up a really interesting phobia. When we used to be in class together, I would have a competition who could find the most interesting phobia, and we'd have a first, second, and third and get prizes. This is the one that won last year. I don't even know if this is a real phobia, but it's really funny. So this phobia is a fear that somewhere, somehow, a duck is watching you. And then it says, Jimmy has this, and it says, your ass is mine, Jimmy. And it made me laugh when a student sent this to me, so this was the winner. But there's lots of interesting ones. So look at some of those phobias. What I put in here, just cute, is a clip from Charlie Brown, where he goes to Lucy for psychiatric help. If you've seen it, she charges 5 cents for it. But she just lists a whole bunch of different phobias that Charlie Brown might have, and he's trying to figure out which one is preventing him. It's interfering with his life. He's not feeling good. Which one could it be? So it's just kind of cute. And then, so that's your homework for tomorrow, is to explain an example of classical conditioning in a phobia, and to find a couple of really interesting phobias. These are just some fun ones. Again, I don't know if all of these are actually true phobias, but I have heard of some of them. Remember, for it to be a true phobia, it has to be an irrational fear, and it has to be out of proportion to the amount of actual danger it possesses. And tomorrow, or the next lesson, we are going to focus on phobia development, explaining it through classical conditioning, and then the process of how you would reverse that using classical conditioning. Because if you can be conditioned to fear any stimulus, you can also be conditioned to have a relaxation response to any stimulus. And that's how they reverse the process. Through classical conditioning, they reverse it the same way. So it's really interesting, and we'll look at that tomorrow, and then some other elements of classical conditioning. Okay, thanks. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye.